Bright, late summer sunlight filtered through the canopy of towering redwood trees, creating a mosaic of dancing shadows across the woodland floor. The day was hot and fragrant, with the scent of damp earth and woody resin. Beams of golden light broke through the thick leaves, illuminating pockets of moss and the occasional patch of bright forest flowers. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, shimmering with the kind of magic found in a child's eyes when they first discover the world. On that August afternoon, 8-year-old Aurora Taggart discovered the magic of Redwood National Park. She was an imaginative child, small for her age, pale-faced and wide-eyed. She clutched her beloved stuffed bear, whom she had named Sherman, a name inspired by an old nature documentary she'd once seen on TV. The plush toy was a relic from her infancy, with worn brown fur and a missing button eye. Sherman had an ear that always flopped forward, hanging forlornly, but Aurora loved him. He was her companion in every adventure, a silent guardian through nights of nightmares and lonely afternoons. Aurora's parents, James and Maria, had decided to bring her to Redwood National Park in hopes of giving her a space to heal and rejuvenate. They had just moved to California earlier that year, and Aurora had been uprooted from her old life, her friends, her grandparents, everything she cherished. She felt lost, drifting like a leaf in the wind. For weeks, she had retreated into the refuge of her imagination, spinning grand tales of knights and dragons with only Sherman to share them. On this special day, the Taggart family wanted to explore a new trail. Rumor had it that there was a quieter path winding through a near mythical grove that visitors often missed. James had pored over park maps, and after a half-hour of careful searching, they found it, a subtle entrance between two enormous redwoods. The hush that fell on them as they ventured into the path was like stepping into a secret realm. "Stay close, Aurora," Maria called as Aurora skipped ahead, eyes shining at the sight of towering trunks and twisting roots. Their steps rustled fallen leaves that crunched underfoot, and the forest's hush accentuated the simple sounds of their presence. Aurora lingered behind her parents to admire the mossy bark of an especially ancient redwood. She found a curious little hollow near its base. "Sherman, look," she whispered, kneeling down to peer inside. It smelled faintly of mushrooms. She pretended it was a portal into another world and giggled at the image of Sherman stepping inside to meet forest fairies and wise talking foxes. Noticing Aurora was lagging, James paused. "Come on, kiddo," he urged gently, turning to lift her onto a larger, knobbly root. In his arms, she felt safe. High up in the redwood's embrace, her heart soared, even if she rarely let that feeling show. She clung to Sherman as the sun continued its slow path across the sky. They spent the afternoon exploring that secret path. James pointed out woodpecker holes and bracket fungi. Maria snapped pictures, capturing her daughter's wide-eyed wonder. Eventually, the family found a spot of open ground where dappled sunlight made the ferns shimmer. They set down a blanket and enjoyed a modest picnic, sandwiches, apple slices, and a thermos of lemonade. Aurora's parents made small talk about work, schedules, and budgets, but Aurora barely listened. She was watching the way the sunlight seemed to make Sherman's battered fur glisten, as though he were coming alive, a forest guardian in miniature. Just as the sun began to dip low in the sky, painting the canopy in shifting shades of copper, they decided it was time to head back. They packed up quickly because James insisted they not lose the main trail. In the mild rush of checking for phones, keys, water bottles, and camera gear, a small tragedy occurred. Aurora, too exhausted and entranced by the forest's beauty, forgot to grab Sherman. They made the trek back. Shadows lengthened around them, and a mild chill brushed their arms. There was a hush that settled in as the last golden rays gave way to grey dusk. By the time they reached the car and turned onto the highway, Aurora was dozing off. Maria glanced in the rearview mirror at her sleeping daughter, feeling a pang of protectiveness. She was relieved Aurora seemed happier than she had been in weeks. In that fleeting moment, she didn't notice that Sherman was no longer in Aurora's arms. It wasn't until they pulled into the driveway of their modest rental home that Aurora realized her bear was missing. Panic gripped her, tears welling in her eyes. She tore through the car, searching between seats, under the floor mats, in the trunk where they'd stored the picnic blanket. But Sherman was gone. She flung herself into her mother's arms, sobbing, heartbreak pouring out of her little frame. "We have to go back," she pleaded. Night had settled in, the sky blanketed by stars. James knelt beside her, his voice thick with sympathy. "We can't go back right now. The park's closed, sweetheart, but we can go tomorrow morning." Aurora looked devastated. What if he's alone? What if he's scared? Maria kissed her daughter's brow. "We'll search first thing tomorrow, darling." "Sherman will be safe, he's a tough little bear," she said softly. "But let's get you to bed. You're so tired." Aurora's eyes were blotchy and red as her tears subsided into silent acceptance. She trudged into the house, leaving muddy footprints behind. Her heart felt as hollow as that old tree she'd discovered. As she drifted to sleep, all she could imagine was the thick dark of the forest and the silent form of her bear, left behind. At dawn, Aurora stirred. She was half-dressed before her parents were even awake. She was determined to rescue Sherman. Over a quick breakfast, James promised they'd drive back to Redwood National Park as soon as possible. The anxious longing on Aurora's face spurred both her parents to hurry, though the trip was nearly an hour from their house. By the time they arrived, the sun was high. Aurora practically bounded out of the car, her eyes still puffy from the tears and poor night's sleep. They returned to the secret trail, but something felt different. It was as though the forest itself had shifted overnight. Perhaps it was the new angle of the morning sun, or a changed breeze. The hush was deeper, and the forest shadows were just a bit longer. They retraced their steps, combing every log, every mossy patch, every nook. The hollow Aurora had found was empty. There was no sign of her bear. The place where they'd picnicked looked undisturbed, as though they'd never even been there. They spent hours calling Sherman's name, rummaging through fern patches, behind trees, and around boulders. At length, James and Maria exchanged worried looks. Maybe someone else had stumbled upon it, or maybe an animal had carted it away. The park was large, and a single stuffed toy could be anywhere. Maria squeezed Aurora's hand gently. "I'm so sorry, sweetie," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "We've looked everywhere. Maybe the park rangers will find him and call us." Aurora couldn't hold back the tears. She dropped to her knees in the damp earth and let out silent sobs. Sherman was all she had to remind her of simpler times, when they still lived near Grandma and Grandpa, near her best friend who shared secrets with her in hushed giggles. Now she was in a new place, friendless, and had lost her loyal companion. She didn't eat that night. She just stared at her bedroom ceiling, wondering if the forest was warm enough to keep Sherman from feeling cold. She cursed herself for not noticing his absence. A swirl of guilt, anger, and sadness knotted inside her, stealing her sleep. In the weeks that followed, Aurora struggled. Her old anxious habits returned. She withdrew more, carrying sorrow like a weight on her back. Nights felt especially long. She would stare at the window, half expecting that Sherman might appear, battered but intact. At the door, some magical reunion. She felt some intangible presence in those late hours, an uneasy sense that she was being watched. By mid-September, Aurora had started the new school year. She drifted through class, lost in a private dreamscape of what-ifs. The teacher's instructions slid off her like water off a leaf. Her parents tried to cheer her up with new stuffed animals, but each one only reminded her of Sherman's absence. No plush could ever replace him. Then something extraordinary happened. It was a Sunday, around the time the leaves of the few deciduous trees in their neighborhood began turning yellow and gold. Aurora was in her room, absently tracing shapes on her desk with a pencil. In the living room, James was watching an old football game while Maria looked over some office files. The day was quiet, windless, an unremarkable autumn day. A sharp knock on the front door shattered the stillness. Aurora froze. They rarely had visitors. Another knock, louder this time. She hopped down from her chair, curiosity piqued, but still overshadowed by her lingering sadness. She made her way to the foyer just as her father was opening the door. "Who could that be?" Maria asked from across the living room. Standing on the front porch was a stranger. He was tall and lean, with deeply tanned skin. He had short, dark hair that looked as if it had been carelessly chopped rather than styled. Clutched in his rough hands was a brown stuffed bear with a missing button eye and a flopped ear. Aurora's heart nearly stopped. Her eyes bulged, and she let out a gasp that took all the air from her lungs. "Sherman," she whispered. The stranger cleared his throat. "I found this in Redwood National Park," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "I believe it belongs to your family." James and Maria glanced at each other in shocked confusion. Maria placed a hand on Aurora's shoulder. "That's my daughter's bear. How did you find our address?" The man's gaze flicked to Aurora and then down at Sherman. He spoke gently. "I found a little ID tag on him." Aurora noticed for the first time that Sherman was wearing an old hospital bracelet around his paw. It was from the day Aurora was born. Her mother had jokingly tied it around the bear's wrist years ago. The band had her full name and birth date, along with her parents' names and their old address. But it definitely didn't list their new California residence. "What do you mean?" James asked, stepping forward. "That ID had our old address on it." The man didn't meet James's eyes. He found his way to me. He fell silent for a moment, as though he had nothing more to say. It was at that moment Aurora realized Sherman was not alone. Around the bear's neck was a necklace of sorts, made from a thin vine or braided grass. And threaded onto that vine were small tokens, a tiny pine cone, a single hawk feather, a few beads that looked like carved bone or maybe petrified wood, and a miniature glass bead that caught the sunlight. "What happened?" Aurora breathed. She was trembling with confusion and a surge of joy. She took a hesitant step forward, her gaze never leaving Sherman. "Where did you find him?" The stranger inhaled slowly. He sounded a little uncertain, even shy. "About a month ago, I found this bear lying at the base of an old redwood. I was camping off trail." He paused, swallowing. There was an unusual feeling in that place, as though something in the forest wanted to protect him, keep him safe. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the whisper of a breeze through the bushes outside. Maria placed a hand to her mouth, eyes suspiciously moist. "You've brought him back to us," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." He extended the bear to Aurora. "Take good care of him," he said simply. Aurora clutched Sherman to her chest, half expecting to wake up from a dream. There was a musty, woody smell on Sherman's fur, and she could feel grains of soil trapped in the fabric seams. But there was something else about him, a sense of being changed, as if the plush had absorbed the ancient spirit of the forest. Even the single shining eye seemed different, more watchful. Before Aurora or her parents could ask any more questions, the man nodded curtly and turned away. In a few quick steps, he disappeared down the street. James jogged after him, calling, "Wait! We don't even know your name." But by the time James reached the curb, the man was gone. It was as though he had melted into the crisp autumn air. Aurora brought Sherman inside, hugging him. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of relief, of disbelief, of gratitude. Maria knelt, gathering Aurora into her arms. "Oh, honey, thank goodness," she whispered over and over, stroking her daughter's hair. James locked the front door and came to them, kneeling beside his wife and child. He gently touched the beads around Sherman's neck. "I wonder who put these here," he mused. Aurora swallowed. "It's like he was part of the forest." The family spent the rest of the day in a strange state of joy and bewilderment. Aurora felt as though the entire world had flipped upside down. She held on to Sherman, refusing to let him out of her sight. Every so often, she pressed her nose into his fur and inhaled that rustic scent. It calmed her like nothing else had. She felt safe, anchored, as though some invisible thread connected her heart to the ancient trees. In the days that followed, Aurora noticed something else. Sherman's presence gave her an inexplicable sense of courage. Her nightmares faded. She began to speak up more in class. It was as though the fear that had settled in her since the move was loosening its grip. She found ways to reach out, offering help to classmates or inviting them to play at recess. Over time, she even made a couple of new friends, a girl named Pilar, who shared Aurora's love of art, and a boy named Timothy, who wanted to form a nature club. Slowly, Aurora grew into a new version of herself. She took Sherman outside more often, perched him in the yard while she drew pictures of the afternoon sky or the birds perched on the power lines. She would whisper the day's events to him before bed, confiding her hopes for tomorrow. It was as though the forest's protective spirit still lingered in the battered plush. Months rolled by. Autumn yielded to winter. The California rains fell, turning the world grey and subdued. The bare branches in the neighborhood glistened after drizzles. Even Redwood National Park experienced weeks of rain, the damp gloom bathing the forest in a quiet hush. Aurora turned 9 in early December. It was a modest celebration, just her parents and a few friends from school. She laughed as she blew out the candles, hugging Sherman afterward, feeling a burst of gratitude for her little life. Then, just before the new year, everything changed again. It started with nightmares. Aurora dreamt she was back in the forest, but this time the sky was ashen and the redwood canopy no longer shielded her. Instead, the giant trees were scorched, blackened husks. Thick smoke curled between the charred trunks. A sorrowful wind moaned, carrying the distant, mournful howling of animals. She walked among the ruins, searching for Sherman, but he was gone. She would wake with a jolt, heart pounding, tears cutting hot trails down her cheeks. She kept these nightmares a secret from her parents at first. She didn't want to worry them, but they started coming more frequently, leaving her anxious and pale during the day. She'd cling to Sherman, finding temporary solace in his scent, though it had begun to fade with time. She realized with mounting despair that something was calling her, some force from the forest. And if she didn't answer, the nightmares might become reality. It was a Saturday in late January when she couldn't bear it any longer. After a fitful night, Aurora woke and declared to her parents that they had to revisit Redwood National Park. James looked at Maria, arching an eyebrow. "I guess we could make a weekend day trip," he offered. Her insistence was unwavering. "I need to go back to where we lost Sherman," she said simply, hugging the bear to her chest. There was a shaky determination in her eyes, an adult seriousness. Maria studied her daughter and saw the deep shadows beneath her eyes, the lines of worry in her brow. She also remembered the day the stranger appeared with Sherman, how Aurora's tears were replaced with hope. Something about Redwood National Park was calling Aurora, and Maria felt it was best not to ignore it. They drove up after lunch, the winter sun low in the sky. The drive was quiet. Aurora clutched Sherman tightly, not speaking. James fiddled with the radio, trying to lighten the mood, but none of the easy listening stations could break Aurora's silence. Soon they arrived at the park. The crowd was thin, it was off-season and chilly. A mist clung to the forest edges, swirling around their ankles as they ventured down the main trail. The hush was profound. Drips of condensation occasionally fell from the high leaves, landing with soft taps on the ground. James and Maria guided Aurora gently, letting her lead the way. She found that secret path again, though it was not quite as she remembered. Winter's hush had turned the ferns brown around the edges, and the ground was slick with decomposing leaves. A gentle wind whispered through the redwoods, as though urging them forward. They retraced their steps to the spot where Aurora had first found that hollow at the base of the tree. There, the trunk loomed, draped in patches of moss, but the hollow was no longer empty. Tucked inside was an arrangement of pine cones, smooth stones, and a single hawk feather like an offering. Aurora's heart thudded. She moved closer, stepping carefully. "Mom, Dad, look," she breathed. Maria placed a hand on Aurora's shoulder. "These look like the little trinkets on Sherman's necklace," she said softly, her eyes round with amazement. James swallowed hard. "This is getting uncanny," he murmured. Aurora placed Sherman gently down at the tree's base, as though returning him to a place of significance. "I think the forest saved him," Aurora said quietly, "and now it needs us." Maria and James exchanged uncertain glances. Their rational minds balked. How could a forest need them? But there was something in Aurora's voice, a truth that resonated. A hush settled between them, and in that quiet, an unspoken understanding blossomed. Suddenly, Aurora reached out to touch the hawk feather. As soon as her fingertip made contact, she felt a jolt, a burst of icy pins and needles radiating through her arm and into her chest. Her vision flickered. She saw images of thick smoke choking the sky, heard the roar of wildfire, smelled the acrid scent of ash. Her knees buckled, and she fell forward. Her parents caught her just in time. "What happened?" Maria gasped, cradling Aurora. Aurora's eyes were wide and unfocused for a moment. She let out a choked sob. "There's going to be a fire," she whispered, her body shaking. "The forest is in danger." James hugged Aurora close, feeling a mounting sense of dread. Wildfires were not uncommon in California, though Redwood National Park was typically cooler and wetter, more resistant to extensive burns, but not impossible. They decided to head directly to the ranger station, as uncertain as their story sounded. They found a lone park ranger inside, a woman with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a green hat. Her name tag read Ranger Sullivan. James explained that they had found evidence of some unusual activity, perhaps a sign of a potential fire hazard or an illegal campsite. He spoke in vague terms about picking up strange warnings. Ranger Sullivan raised an eyebrow, but her expression softened when she noticed Aurora's terror. Aurora added quietly, "We think there might be a fire soon, maybe in a spot people don't usually go. The forest is warning us." Ranger Sullivan nodded slowly. "We do have vantage points to monitor the area. Although redwood forests are pretty resilient, we've had a few unusual dryness spells. I'll alert our patrol to keep an eye out." "Thank you for letting me know." They left the station feeling both relief and lingering unease. Aurora glanced at Sherman. The bear's button eye seemed to glimmer in the fluorescent lighting. Then she noticed the hawk feather in her own hand. She didn't remember picking it up, yet there it was. She tucked it into Sherman's braided necklace, as if returning it to its rightful place. That night, Aurora fell asleep, cradling Sherman, the hawk feather pressed to her chest. She didn't dream of the forest burning. Instead, she dreamt of gentle rain falling on the redwoods, of new growth and life. For a while, nothing happened. Winter rolled into spring. Aurora's nightmares abated. She laughed more, kept growing closer with her small circle of friends, and found joy in painting watercolor landscapes of redwood groves. She even started a small garden in their backyard, planting tiny succulents in clay pots and tending them after school. Sherman sat nearby as though cheering her on. Every night, she clutched him as she drifted to sleep. Life carried on until late June, when a freak heat wave struck California. Temperatures soared to record highs, scorching the land. The news was filled with red flag warnings, cautioning about wildfire danger in the tinder dry brush. A pit formed in Aurora's stomach every time the TV repeated grim tidings. The memory of her earlier vision crept back into her thoughts, igniting a cold dread. Then, at the peak of that heatwave, Ranger Sullivan called. She remembered Aurora and her parents because their story had been so unusual. A wildfire had broken out in a remote region of the park, likely started by a lightning strike. Local fire crews were mobilizing, but the terrain was rugged, difficult to navigate. The flames threatened a small grove near Redwood Creek, overlook an ancient stand of giant redwoods that might be centuries old. If the fire spread, the park could lose an irreplaceable treasure. When Aurora heard the news, she felt tears sting her eyes. She remembered her dream, blackened trunks, drifting smoke, an eerie hush. She clasped Sherman so tightly, her knuckles turned white. "It's happening," she whispered to her parents. "We have to help." Of course, there wasn't much they could do directly. Firefighting was left to trained professionals. But they could volunteer, offer supplies, even just lend moral support. So Aurora begged her parents to take her to the volunteer center near the park. They packed first aid kits, bottles of water, some blankets, energy bars, anything that might help the rangers and firefighters. The scene at the volunteer center was chaotic but purposeful. Park staff, local residents, and volunteers bustled about, organizing supply stations, loading trucks with water and equipment. Ranger Sullivan was there, her silver hair peeking out from beneath a soot-stained hat. She recognized Aurora immediately. "Hey, kid," she greeted softly, exhaustion etched in her face. "So you were right, unfortunately. The forest is hurting." She knelt to Aurora's eye level. "You've done your part, though. We're all doing everything we can." Aurora looked into the older woman's weary eyes. "Is there anything we can do?" She held Sherman in her arms. "We have to save the forest." Ranger Sullivan forced a half smile. "We need all the prayers and good thoughts we can get. Maybe you and Sherman can bring us some luck." The news coverage that day showed flames licking the bases of the smaller trees, smoke pluming into the sky. Helitankers flew overhead, dumping water and fire retardant. Crews dug fire breaks, trying to protect the largest stands of old growth. Aurora watched with a trembling heart. She could almost feel the forest's pain radiating through her. She clutched Sherman, whispering silent pleas that the ancient realm would be spared. Then, late that afternoon, something extraordinary happened. The wind shifted abruptly, pulling cool air from the coast. Clouds gathered. A drizzle began, pattering softly at first, then intensifying. It wasn't a torrential downpour, but it was steady enough to halt the fire's advance. By twilight, the flames were mostly under control. Firefighters declared the grove was saved. Back at the volunteer center, a collective cheer rose up. People hugged one another, relief shining in tearful eyes. Ranger Sullivan knelt again by Aurora. "That drizzle was nothing short of a miracle," she said quietly. "A little help from Mother Nature." Aurora looked down at Sherman. The hawk feather in his necklace seemed to gleam as a trickle of rain dripped over it. She smiled through her tears. "The forest fought back," she whispered, "and it won." That night, the Taggarts returned home well past midnight. Aurora was exhausted. She collapsed into her bed, still hugging Sherman. She had a final, fleeting image of the redwood grove alive, standing tall beneath the gentle rain, the flicker of flames now smothered. She fell asleep with gratitude pumping through her heart. Weeks passed, and the fire's scars slowly healed, though small patches of charred brush remained in more remote sections. Summer advanced. Aurora grew older in spirit, if not in years. She felt a profound connection to Redwood National Park, a kinship with the ancient giants that had stood watch over the land for centuries. She realized that her heartbreak over losing Sherman had somehow bonded her to the forest, forging a link she had never thought possible. When she visited the grove next, the air was sweet with the scent of wet bark and new undergrowth. Ranger Sullivan, though busy with recovery efforts, found time to greet her. Together, they walked through some of the areas that had been singed, seeing early sprouts of green amidst the blackened earth. "It's amazing," Aurora breathed, marveling at a tiny fern unfurling in the ash. "Life always finds a way to come back." Sullivan nodded. "It does. And you helped, Aurora." The ranger's gaze drifted to Sherman, who was tucked under Aurora's arm. "Or should I say, you and Sherman helped. You reminded us to pay attention, to be prepared. We were lucky." Aurora thought of the day she lost Sherman, how devastated she had felt. She remembered the mysterious stranger who returned him, a stranger who had melted into thin air, leaving behind a sense of wonder and gratitude. She recalled the braided necklace with its pine cone, beads, and feather that had inexplicably connected her to the forest's spirit. She turned Sherman over, running her fingers across his worn fur. He had changed over those months. He was more than a stuffed bear now. He was a symbol of resilience, of friendship between humans and nature, of personal growth that is sometimes birthed through sorrow. She found herself whispering, "Thank you for saving him," though she wasn't sure who she was speaking to, the man, the forest, or perhaps something far older that lived within the redwood's silent presence. A breeze rustled through the leaves overhead, as if in response. On a sunny afternoon that August exactly a year since the day Aurora had first lost Sherman, she and her parents returned to Redwood National Park. This time, there was no anxious searching, no dread. They simply wanted to spend time together in the forest that had become so important to their family. The area was vibrant with new life, the scorched spots hidden beneath fresh ferns and wildflowers. The redwoods stood tall, unaffected giants that had borne witness to countless seasons, storms, and smaller fires. The hush was comforting, a natural cathedral for reflection. Aurora knelt by the same hollow in the old trunk, setting Sherman down gently. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small polished stone she had found at the beach. She placed it in the hollow, next to the feathers and pine cones that remained there like an ever-growing shrine. She smiled, imagining the forest spirits delighting in these humble tokens. But she did not leave Sherman behind this time. Instead, she hugged him tight, then looked up at her parents. "I think we can share the forest with him without losing him," she said. They nodded, understanding. A sudden snap of a twig made them all turn. There, partially hidden behind a thick trunk, stood the mysterious stranger who had returned Sherman a year ago. He was dressed in similar rough attire, jeans and a dark T-shirt, stained with patches of green. His eyes were kind, though tinged with sadness or reverence. When Aurora's eyes met his, he gave a tiny nod, as if to say, "I see you. You did well." Before she could speak, he ducked behind the trunk. James ran forward, but again the man was gone, vanished into the maze of towering redwoods. This time, however, Aurora did not feel unsettled or confused. She sensed he was part of this place, some caretaker or guardian who roamed the paths, watching over lost children and lost bears alike. She exhaled, turning back to her parents. They shared a look of amazement, but none of them felt any fear. They simply felt gratitude for being touched by a mystery so gentle and profound. Aurora clutched Sherman, kissing the top of his head. She gazed at the ancient trunks, at the shafts of sunlight streaming through the leaves. A wave of emotion swelled within her. She remembered how heartbreak had once weighed her down, how losing a simple stuffed toy had felt like losing part of her soul. But through her pain, she had learned that connections can span distances, that resilience can bloom in the face of hopelessness, and that even the slightest spark of kindness can grow into a flame that banishes darkness. In that moment, a hush fell over the forest, thick as a summer dream. The sun, filtering down through the redwoods, illuminated motes of dust dancing in the air like glittering spirits. Aurora let her eyes drift shut, feeling the moss beneath her shoes, hearing the whisper of the wind in the high branches. She was home connected, safe, and alive with possibility. When she opened her eyes, her parents were smiling at her. She saw pride and love shining in their faces. There was no need for words. She understood, in a way that transcended language, that all of them, Aurora, Sherman, James, Maria, the stranger, and the ancient redwoods, were threads woven into the same cosmic tapestry. A tapestry spun from heartbreak, wonder, resilience, and love.